Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our fourth webinar for the Learning Journey in Regenerative Finance. How's everyone doing today? I'd love to hear how you're doing. Maybe drop a little comment in the chat box. How you feeling today? Let us know how you're doing. I see Jeff and Skipper here. We're just starting to see more people showing up. So welcome, Penny. Welcome, Kathy. Lovely to have you guys here. Hey there, Darren. I see a few more people are logging in, so we'll give a moment before we get started. Welcome, Ellen. How are you doing today? Really looking forward to our conversation today. Hi, Gail. How's it going over there? As you can see, I am in the indoor space of our volunteer community house in Barichara. And so I'll be leading the session from here today. Really excited to talk about our topic today, which is something we've been working on here in Barichara. And as you may know from reading the description, that we'll be talking about how we are. Oh, thanks, Jeff. The thing is the headphones. If my headphones are in, the audio works. If my headphones aren't in, something weird with the hardware and software in my computer. But yeah, so we are going to be talking today about how to think about regenerative finance through the lens of real world complexity, where you have a real situation with all of the nuances and different elements involved. And how can we apply what we've been learning about the social dynamics between groups of people, how to manage a commons, and the work of Elinor Ostrom, to create pro-social environments for cooperation and collective action. And how we talked last week about the ecological flow of energy and nutrients through ecosystems, and how this relates to the different kinds of value that are created, stored, and flow within real economies through the lens of multi-capitalism. And so today what we're going to do is hold in mind these kinds of perspectives. The perspective that regenerative finance is about the flow of value through a real world ecological system, and how there are many different kinds of value that exist, so that we can look at a real world situation and try to see where are those different pieces coming up and how do they interact with each other. So with that said, we'll be using the same format as normal, so start the presentation in just a moment. Before we do, just your friendly housekeeping reminder that there's the chat box that many of you are using in the side. Keep chatting and sharing ideas and dropping links and having conversations there. The Ask a Question button here for us to use for the Q&A part of our conversation. And you guys know the drill, so I don't think I need to say more about that. But what I'm really excited about today is we are going to talk about, in some ways, the personal struggle of my family in the last 6 months, which is how we have gone from visiting a piece of land to eventually raising the money to buy this piece of land to building a set of capacities in our conversations to complete a land purchase. And while that may not sound like it's really that complicated or interesting, as you'll see when we get into this example, that there were lots of unexpected twists and turns, and there are broken institutions that really got in our way, cultural differences between all the people involved, and that all of this turned out to be very important to the flow of different kinds of value as we're building a reforestation project here in Barichara, Colombia. So with that said, let's jump in and get started, shall we? I'll start the presentation part of today's webinar. So today, what I want to talk to you all about is a real-world example of regenerative finance. And the real-world example that we're going to talk about, wow, I've got an ant biting my foot. Ha, welcome to the Andes. What we're going to talk about today is a specific piece of land that came into our world in early August of last year. Right now, for the sake of posterity in the recording, it's the beginning of May 2021. So in August last year, about 9 months ago, I visited this piece of land for the first time. And we now have completed the land purchase just about 2 weeks ago. So there was a 9-month-long process that took us from connecting to a piece of land to being in a place where we can collaborate with the neighbors and build a project that is emblematic for the entire territory while working with partners across the territory who have their own projects. And so we're going to really focus in today on this piece of land, which I'll highlight for you now, is this piece of land right here, just 3.2 hectares, a little more than 3 hectares of land. And as you can see, if I zoom back out, that it's very degraded land. Just looking at this satellite image from Google Earth, you can see this is the area, and below it is a building and a parking lot, or actually a playground, because that's a school. And the degradation of the land continues going down slope from us, which will be important for the nature of this project. What I'd like to do is start by showing you what this land looks like. This is some drone footage of the land. So you can really see that this is a place that is heavily eroded. It's a place that was deforested a very long time ago. And while there is part of this drainage basin that has trees in it, going diagonally from the upper right to the lower left, that the area above and the area below are just quintessentially degraded land. So this is land that is at the top of a ridgeline, at the top of what here in Colombia is called a microcuenca, or a tributary for a river system, where the water runs downhill and eventually joins the Barichara River below. And this is a place that we are now beginning to do reforestation work. And so as you can see, this is a dramatic piece of land to work on because it's got steep slopes, heavy erosion, and exposed mineral clay deposits and very, very little soil. So this is land that we're taking from a low level of ecological capacity, and we'll be restoring the native forest here. And so why do we want to do that? What is it ecologically about this piece of land that makes it so valuable for the entire territory? If it's only 3 hectares, it's not a very big piece of land. And it has to do with where it is on the landscape. So we're naming the nature reserve for this piece of land. We're naming it Origen del Agua in Spanish, or origin of water in English. And I want to show now briefly how this origin of water land is connected to 3 vital processes that bring water into the territory. So as we're doing the regenerative design work for landscapes, we need to understand what are these ecological benefits, because they're part of the value that is in the system just by where the land is located in the landscape. So first of all, as I said, there's a ridgeline, and the land starts here more in the bottom right, and you can see it's actually at the high point on this ridgeline. And there's a set of aquifers, underground flow of water that runs down this ridgeline from the high point, which is where the land is located, the highest part of the ridgeline. And this brings groundwater to the village of Barichara, which has 6,000 people in its population. And up until the 1990s, all of the water for the village of Barichara came from this aquifer system. This groundwater is how people would have wells in their gardens, in their yards, and they would scoop buckets of water out of these wells. And the water came from this aquifer system. So by cutting down the trees at the top of this aquifer system, the water runs away instead of absorbing into the ground. If it absorbs into the ground, it infiltrates and fills this aquifer system. So if we want to provide stable, secure water to the town of Barichara, then we need the land at the top of this ridgeline to have forest on it. So one way that this piece of land, the origin of water, is it's the place where the groundwater comes from, starting at the top of the ridgeline and going to Barichara. The second origin of water is that if you look at the top of the ridgeline at the surface water, the water drains down this tributary, which is about 50 hectares of land, making an S shape that runs down into the Barichara River below, down in the valley. So here's a place where the land at the top is, because of heavy erosion, is not only not recharging the aquifer, but the water that's running downhill, it's running very quickly, and it's taking a lot of sediments with it, with water-based erosion. So this is another origin of water, because this is one of the starting points for water to fill the drainage basin of the entire Barichara River. This is one of about 15 tributaries that is in the territory. The third way that this is a point of origin for water is that there's a connection between the highest points in the landscape and the moisture that's moving by in the air above. And if there's enough moisture in the tree canopy and the plants at the surface of the land, then clouds that enter will continue moving. But if there are not trees, if it's bare dirt and rock, then it's a lot hotter and drier at the surface, which causes the clouds to evaporate and move away, meaning that it's less likely that rain will come. So at these high points on the land, if you have bare earth instead of ground cover with lots of plants and vegetation, you reduce the amount of rain that comes, which means you begin increasing the likelihood that the landscape becomes like a desert. So this ecological basis for calling this land the origin of water is that it's going to increase cloud formation and help bring more rain. It's going to help support the healthy recharging of aquifers and the groundwater supply for the village of Barichara. And it's also going to help bring water into the river system that is providing for agriculture and industrial uses in the territory below. So these are three aspects of the regenerative design for the ecology of this landscape that are all very important kinds of value, just in the nature of how the landscape is shaped and how water moves through it. Also, because it's the endpoint, it's at one of the endpoints of this aquifer system, we can collaborate with another project, the Moncora Bioparque project that is here on the left, right above Barichara. And what you can see is we're beginning to do reforestation work at the top with this new nature reserve. But there's already been 12 years of reforestation work here at the bottom, and we've been volunteering and doing work there for the last year and a half. So as we help create projects for reforestation and for water retention in both of these places, we are beginning a process to bring water resilience and water security to the town of Barichara. And that's in addition to all of the ecological benefits that are created by the water being stored in the ground, and by bringing more forest cover and more biodiversity that is maintained in the landscape itself. And so you can see that there's a lot of erosion and degradation in the land, both above and below. So we really have our work cut out for us. But what's beautiful is that we are already digging our fingers into this dirt and preparing it for holding more water and for growing plants. So we've built the relationships with the Bioparque to do a lot of work there. And now that we have the ability to set up a reforestation project at the top, we're starting to do territorial work in two relatively small projects because they're connected across the larger shape in the landscape itself. What I want to do now is shift from the ecological aspects and look a little bit more at the economic aspects of this nature reserve. So the way that we raised money to buy this land was we started with crowdfunding. We received money and donations to be able to buy this piece of land, and we received money and donations from our general GoFundMe crowdfunding campaign, which some of that money has been set aside for this project. We got to the point where we'd raised almost a little bit more than a third of the money from crowdfunding. And we worked with Jeff McNeely, who's one of the hosts for these learning journeys, to create a shared equity model where you could have up to 6 investors, each of them giving between $2,000 and $5,000 of $15,000 in total. And we asked them to give us 0 interest loans, which means they're not getting any financial return. They're getting their money back, but they're not making money off of this piece of land. And so what we can already see is that the financial return is not one of the values that is being recognized as something we're creating in this project. But the value of using your money to create an ecological outcome is already one of the motivations for these investors. And then my family put in $4,000 of our own money, which means we have 6 investors in total, if you include my wife and I as one of those. And between us, we are sharing the responsibility for buying and stewarding this piece of land. And in this way, we are able to leverage the strength of our seed investors to increase the number of donations that we would get. And we'd be able to use the donations to increase the comfort of our potential seed investors that they should become stewards of this land. And by putting our own money in and putting our own skin in the game, we're saying we believe so much in this project that we'll put our own money into it as well. So this way of creating trust and inspiration to motivate others to participate was a really critical part of raising enough money to buy this land. So what I'm showing here is that the economic part has to do with finance, but not about financial return. And it also has to do with trust, inspiration, ecological benefit, and many other things than money that all together made it possible for us to raise the money to buy this piece of land. Here is the land as viewed when you're standing on it, where you can see the school is down below and you get a sense of just how hard packed the clay is. These things that look like rocks in front of us are actually sandstone packed down by the sun baking them and from cows and goats walking on them. If you pick up some of that rock, it'll crumble in your fingers if you smash the pieces together. But they're pretty hard and they feel like rocks until you start to break them. So this is land that is going to have a very hard time regenerating on its own. But we can regenerate it much more quickly by knowing how to do reforestation and permaculture work. The other thing about this photograph is that I took this picture the day that we agreed to purchase the land. The day that we said, we've now raised the money, and the family that we were buying it from had accepted the price. They'd offered us a price, we accepted it, and we bought this, or we said we'd buy this piece of land. The amazing thing is, it took us 3 more months until nearly the end of April before we were able to give them the money sitting in our bank account, because we weren't able to get it from a US bank account to a Colombian bank account and then into the hands of the campesino family that we were buying this land from. And the story I want to tell you now is how we navigated all of that difficulty to turn this land into a nature reserve, which is what we're now able to do. So I want to tell the story of pro-social land negotiation, how we went about purchasing this land in a way that is rather different from most land purchases. And what I'm going to do now is actually stop screen sharing so that we can, so you can just see me better as I tell this story. And what I really want to do is I want to tell this story to all of you in a way that helps us begin to see, how does regenerative finance work? And so the important thing to know about this piece of land is the way that the money first started coming in was I took pictures of the land the first day that I was there, when I felt a very strong connection, as though the land was asking me to come and heal it. And I posted on Facebook saying, this land feels like it should be decolonized and it shouldn't be privately owned. It should be put in a land trust and used for the benefit of the community. And friends started offering to give me money even before I asked for money. And I raised $10,000 of the money to buy this land, simply by people being so inspired by my dream for the land. So the inspirational capital in that moment and the possibility of creating ecological capital immediately attracted a lot of the money that we would need. So we decided to start a conversation with the owners. And that's when we learned that there were 7 brothers and sisters who together owned this piece of land, and that their grandfather had owned a much larger 100 hectares of land, and his children inherited it when they broke it into pieces for all of them. And then these grandchildren, who are now in their 50s and 60s today, are the owners of the land who have inherited it afterwards. And this 3 hectares of land is a piece that was owned together by 7 siblings. And each of them had their own separate piece of land that they cared for. So this is the piece of land that no one in the family was caring for, which is why it's so neglected and degraded. And we started to sit with the family and say to them, you know, how much money would it take to buy this land if we create a community project? And if we maybe don't buy the land from you, but we lease it from you and your family is able to keep it? Or possibly we give you some money for the land, but less than you're asking for, and your children or your grandchildren inherit the land at some point in the future, and we will reforest it and set restrictions on how it can be used so it remains a forest forever. We started this dialogue with them. And of course, these are just country people here in the rural part of the Barichara territory. So they didn't really trust us as outsiders. They kept thinking, you're from the US, you must have a lot of money, and didn't realize how we were raising this money and what our responsibilities were. And so we recruited the help of one of our friends, a Colombian woman named Margarita. And I remember the first time she talked to 2 of these siblings. She was standing there on the land with them, and she said to one of them, I'm really embarrassed. And the woman who was one of the owners of the land said, why are you embarrassed? And she said, why is it that we Colombians don't care for our own land? And it has to take someone from the north, a white guy from the United States, to come here and say that we should put a forest on this land. This is our land. Why don't we care for it? And so she was opening up a space of sympathy and compassion and recognizing a history of cultural trauma, which began to get the family to think of us a little bit differently, and gradually came to a point where we transformed the dialogue. Flash forward to mid-December, when we decided that we would try to raise all of the money using that shared equity model, the one with the zero interest loans. And we raised the money between mid-December and mid-January. And around January 19th, we go back to the family and we take that picture I'd shown you a moment ago. We sit down with the family and we start a dialogue about buying the land. And we tell the family, we want to talk about your ancestors. We want to invite them into the room with us before we have this conversation. And we asked all of the brothers and the sister, how did this land look and feel when they were children, 50, 60 years ago? How has it changed between then and now? And they started talking about the cutting down of the trees. And when the paved roads came in the 80s, and when the tractors started to come and they really destroyed the land. And they talked about the different kinds of crops that were grown to sell into the global marketplace, and how now all of their children have moved away and live in the cities and don't want to live on this land and don't want to inherit it. So they think at least they should get some money out of it because no one's going to take care of it anyway. And we noticed during this conversation that two of the more stoic, tough farmer guys in this group had tears in their eyes and they started to cry, because we were talking about caring for their land in honor of their ancestors and giving it to their grandchildren. And in this space, we told them that we have the money. We have the amount of money that they had asked. They don't have to go down in price, but we cannot give them this money unless they agree to help us fulfill the dream of this land for their grandchildren. That they want to see a native forest come back, that they want to see a forest reserve there that their family can be proud of. And this is a family that has owned this land for at least 5 generations. They go back very far in time. And so this is already a very interesting place, that for us to buy the land, we turned them into the investors. We said money is not the deciding factor here. This deal is only going to happen if you as a family care about your own territory, the place of your birth. And I said, for my part, I'm an outsider. It's not for me to say what happens to this land. You are from here. So if I come here with money to buy this land, and if I come here with people with reforestation knowledge and permaculture experience, I can't do anything on this land if the local people don't care about it too. And because it's the top of this tributary and all of these families have farms down below, they're going to directly benefit from the water that is held and that moves across their fincas. So we want to work with them. And we told them this, that we would buy these 3 hectares of land to get the opportunity to work with all of their families in the tributary all the way down below to the Barichara River. And this is when the conversation really began to change. And that's when we said, we'll buy the land. We're just making a bank transfer. We'll get the money to you by next Wednesday. And then 6 weeks went by. And the bank held our money, refusing to allow it into the country, and eventually sent it back. And we had to hire professional lawyers and professional financial analysts and financial assessors to help us build the capacity to get the local bank to allow our money into the country. And this took 3 months. After 1 month, we decided to do something risky, which was to create a promise to buy, what in Colombia is called a compra venta, a promise to buy. And to do this, we have to make a down payment. So we asked a Colombian friend to set up a personal bank account, and then we moved our money for all of this work into their personal bank account, which they could have stolen. But this is someone we trusted and was a friend. And then we took that money out in cash, and we used it to make a down payment on the land, which was about a fifth or a sixth of the total amount of money we needed to pay, about $7,000. And if we didn't get the rest of the money to them by a month later, we would lose that investment. And we decided to do this because we couldn't get our money legally into our bank account. And so we found a workaround to get some money to the family. And then we kept trying to get the bank to allow our money in and working on it and running into lots of problems. It was just a very challenging situation, something that should be so simple. It turns out there are money laundering laws here in Colombia, and the banks were afraid to let our money in without verifying the legal origin of funds. And because we raised money from 200 people in crowdfunding, we couldn't go to each of those 200 people and ask them to verify the legal activities, the legal nature of their work activities. Someone donates $5, they shouldn't have to show that their income is legal to a foreign country just so that we can make a bank transfer. So we had lots of challenges with this. And keep moving forward. What happened was when we went to the bank to get that cash and make the down payment, one of the brothers started to cry and he said, "I hope my granddaughter gets to see this forest back in all of its glory. And I hope I live long enough, but I don't think I will. I think I'm too old." And we already started to feel that they were taking the dream seriously, that this wasn't just about making money from foreigners to sell some land. They were remembering how to care for their own land. And so what I want to really stress here in this land negotiation is that we kept shifting the story and shifting the dialogue about what the conversation was about, what this land purchase was about, consistently focusing on the ancestors, future generations, and the ecological health of the territory. And by doing this, we were able to recruit the money from outside and complete a negotiation with the family. And after 3 months, between mid-January and late April, we were finally able to get the money to them, almost 2 weeks after our compraventa had expired, which means technically we should have lost our down payment. But because we built so much trust through this process, everyone kept going. And when we went to visit the sister who was told we should be ashamed for not caring for our land, we went to visit her 2 days after finishing the purchase. And my wife and I sat down at her house and she invited us to have lunch with her. And we felt like we were neighbors. And we felt like they were people that we would know for a very long time because of this work. Now, I want to do to finish the presentation part of our discussion today is I want us to look briefly at how does this work? What did we do? The way that we did this pro-social land negotiation was we built foundations of trust. And as we encountered broken institutions, we weaved relationships. And we continued weaving the relationships the whole time, leveraging the help of our Colombian friends, building relationships with this campesino family, keeping our donors and investors informed the whole time we were doing this work, just to complete the purchase of a piece of land. And we did this by starting with the inspirational capital that brought in the first money. And there was a flow of regenerative finance. Remember, the financial flow is the movement and the coordination of value. And the financial flow started with knowledge capital and social capital. People who trusted us to do good work and believed that we know what we're doing gave us money to do this work. And we started directing these different kinds of capital, weaving them through the relationships the entire time so that we can build the political capital to make decisions together with local people, and that we can increase ecological capital by building soils, retaining water, growing the biodiversity, and restoring the native forest, while also creating more water security for the village and more water security for the agriculture that's in the valley below. All of this is happening because of the way that we manage the dynamic of these relationships as we weave them the entire time. So one way to think about this is to consider a design approach that looks something like this. If you want to create a regenerative finance project, start by conducting ecological assessments, which is to look at the actual earth-based, land-based, place-based elements of the projects you're going to do. How does this relate to humans and the natural world? How do we build our capacities to be in greater harmony and have greater health for the entire ecological systems that we're a part of? We could see in our case with origins of water that there was the groundwater, the surface water, and the meteorology of the region, and then the relationship to the ecosystems themselves that are all key factors. But then what did we do? We didn't start reforesting. We didn't start planting trees. No, we engaged in transformational dialogues, dialogues that change minds, dialogues that open hearts, dialogues that heal cultural trauma and process cultural grief and ecological grief. And through these transformational dialogues, hybrid models emerge, different ways of doing things that no one had thought of before, ways that we didn't know. We proposed the idea that we would create a foundation that would own this land, and that this foundation could then give the land back to the grandchildren of the family. And we don't yet know if that's what we're going to do. But what's interesting is we kept experimenting with different hybrid forms of nonprofit and for-profit, investment and donation, collaboration and purchase, or collaboration and transaction. Lots of hybrids that we were working with, all part of and emerging from our transformational dialogues. And this continued to build a regenerative culture so that the Campesino family, our Colombian friends, our investors, we ourselves were all living in a way that brought vibrancy and life, meaning and purpose to us as participants in the process. And all of this is what will enable us to make ecological improvements to the land. So notice how we might start with ecological assessments to say, what is the context we're working in and what is the work that needs to be done? But the actual work that we do is cultural change, transformational dialogues, creating different mental models, different ways of doing things, innovation and creativity, and living in a dynamic improvisational culture with all of the people involved as we go about the work. I want to just make a point here that we were able to engage in these transformational dialogues because we participated in strategic framing. Now, framing, for those of you who don't know, comes from cognitive linguistics. A frame is a concept held in the human mind, grounded in the human body, that enables us to make sense of the world and to organize our experiences. So frames are fundamental to making sense of the world. Strategic framing is about choosing the frames that we live in. So we turned the seller into the investor. So the person who was receiving the money had to invest in the land purchase for us to give them the money. That meant we turned the frame upside down. We turned the logic around. And we did this because we knew that the logic was not fixed in the world, it's just a cultural norm. Also, we knew that by building inspiration and building good relationships, building trust and cooperation, that we could produce positive ecological outcomes. So we focus on ecological regeneration by engaging in cultural regeneration. That's a strategic framing that tells us where to focus our energy and how to understand the work that we're doing. So what I want to ask you as you reflect on this story is what other kinds of strategic framing were involved? What other mental models, cultural norms, social values were we embodying as we engaged in this land negotiation to set up this nature reserve? And so with that said, let's start our discussion. What can we learn from this? What can we take and practice by looking at what was done in this real world example and see what we'd like to copy for ourselves? Here you can see my daughter from just 2 days ago, where I wrote the letters of the alphabet and she started copying them to learn how to write so that she can learn how to read. We need to be practicing in the same way how to build regenerative finance and regenerative economies. So anytime there's an example of someone who's done something that worked, what can we copy, what can we learn from it, and what can we apply in different contexts? And that's what I'd like to have a conversation about now. So with that said, let's start a conversation, shall we? I'd love to know what you all think about, how you feel about this case study, this example, what questions you have, what insights you might draw. I'm just very interested to hear from you. So I'm seeing that there's Are there any questions that people have or any comments you'd like to drop in the chat box to get us started in a discussion? Because I think this is a really good opportunity for us to take the story that I told, which is obviously an oversimplification of what happened, and to embellish it, to bring details to it, to learn how what we actually did is so different from what we might have predicted. Because we might have predicted Joe's going to go on GoFundMe and raise the money. Then he's just going to go and hand them some money and it's over and done. But we knew that this cultural element was so important. And we didn't know how difficult the banks were going to be. And we had to manage the trust of all the people who were supporting us as we went about this work. And so I'm really interested in how do we have this learning conversation between us to be able to do this work. And I can see that Jeff is asking a question here, so I'll invite Jeff onto the screen. And Jeff's question is regenerative always about land and ecology, or can regenerative finance be applied without a direct connection to land? Can people ourselves be the recipients of regeneration without land connection? I think I know where Jeff's going with this, but Jeff, that's a great question.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Hear
well,
you now.
Can you hear me? Testing, testing.
Hold on.
Testing again. Can you hear me now? Maybe, maybe not.
Okay, I had to change my headset. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Something about the headset was not allowing mic and sound. Now I can hear everything.
Well, I love your question because it lets us do two things. It lets us show that humans are never separate from land. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So I'll come back to that point. But what I wanted to ask you is, or to invite from you is, what are you thinking here? Like, how do you see this way of thinking about regeneration applying to people, whether or not there's a piece of land involved? What were you thinking about here?
Well, I mean, I wasn't thinking about something specific, but I've been struggling sort of in conversation with PJ over the last week and thinking through, some of the examples and everything else. It's like, does regeneration always have to, ultimately be about, healing the land or restoring the land? Because if, I don't know, you're urban dwellers and you don't have much more than, a container on the in the bathtub, I don't know, like that's you don't really have a direct connection other than I can go walk in the park and public spaces or whatever. But, I want to do regenerative work. I want to be regenerative. I want to, work towards a mindset that values the living systems of, and the planet itself as an important part. Yet, I working to support, family and stuff, it's like, so where is there an intersection between like being regenerative and working to, create a project or do, create a startup, create a business and have the ethics and moral compass of like regenerative culture and land, land valued as important, but all the stuff I do might not have to do with like planting trees and getting the water back into the aquifer. And, so like, where's the like real world tangible, like I can start something and do it this way and it's regenerative when I don't have, like your site is so obvious, like, yes, let's get some trees here. Let's keep the water in the ground. Let's replenish the aquifer. Like that's clearly and obviously regenerative. But, it's like, I keep thinking about, I want to have a company that employs all of us and pays all our, our benefits and wages just for being part of the company. And then maybe it deploys us in little pro-social teams to go do different projects. And each project is completely unrelated to anything else. And we're not paid by the project, right? We're paid by, the firm that's hosting all of these regenerative projects. Just as an example, like how do we give people the chance to show up and do their best work, whatever it is they want to do, and they're regenerating themselves, their spirit, their connection to everything, by not having to be a wage slave that is dependent on a paycheck in order to not have life fall apart, right? So I'm trying to go from taking care of the land that sustains us to here we are right now, people, what can we do, or how can we come together to do something that allows us to live in this manner and detach ourselves from the tendrils of the leech, the parasite of capitalism that's making us be productive 100% of the time. That's what I'm thinking about here.
I'm loving this because I said I was going to save the comment about how we're all connected to the land until later, and it's actually a good place to bring it back in. And that is, every living thing needs a place to live. Like a bacteria needs to be in a little pool of water somewhere. There are insects that live on the bottom of leaves. There's always a place where the life system happens. And for humans, that's no different. Humans get food that comes from land somewhere. Humans get air that moves through land and atmosphere somewhere. Our waste products go back into land and so on. And so we are part of land-based systems as a land-based biological organism. So one way you can start to answer this question is, if I'm not working the land, I can at least support the kind of work on land that is more regenerative. And this can relate to like grain consumption, buying organic, going to your farmer's market, and those sorts of things, which are all good to do. But there's also this other deeper, like metaphysical part, which is to not just do those things because they're better for the environment, but to really recognize that we are animated earth, that we are like living dust. We are the surface of the earth's crust, animated as land-based organisms. And so our land connection is our identity. We are part of the planet that is alive. When we're able to go to that deep metaphysical place, which is completely true, as it turns out, from that place, we treat ourselves and we treat each other differently. And so it's not simply about what purchases we make and how it relates to those material flows of agriculture and water use and recycling, which are all important. But at a deeper level, we start to heal the connection of where we felt separate and lost. And that healing is how we become able to find others who see the same way and then work with each other as we're doing in this learning journey. And we're able to do things like, you could contribute money to buying this land through the GoFundMe campaign, and other people did too. So you can help empower other people to do regenerative work that is now part of your work because they're interconnected. And that comes from the understanding that it's all connected. So these are like steps in the direction that don't solve it, but they're absolutely things we can do now. So I love this question. And I saw lots of interest, like, yeah, this is a great discussion topic, maybe for the community calls. So yeah, thank you for this, Jeff. It's a lovely thing to think more about. Onward we go. Yeah, what a great question. And I see there's another question here by Gail. So I'll invite Gail into the screen. And Gail is saying, many of the concepts you mentioned are already an important part of traditional fundraising: gaining trust, appealing to donors' passions and interests, involving donors in your projects, etc. How is regenerative finance different? Well, Gail, I'm curious about your answer to that question with all of your experience with fundraising. And I'll offer my thoughts too, but I'm just curious what you think. What is the difference?
Because when I listen to the story, a lot of it sounds like, yeah, if there's a donor, you want them to identify with the project, to feel some sympathy, empathy, connection, whatever word you want to use for the project, feel like they're contributing by giving their money, following up with them, cultivating donors, all that stuff is like fundraising 101. And being with a nonprofit that's tiny and just run by 2 people, the ability for us to do that and run the projects and everything else is limited.
Mhm.
So I'm still having trouble like seeing how learning regenerative finance is going to be any different from what I'm already trying to do. Because as I've spoken about before, we've gotten money already from people who know and trust us and continue to get that money. But whenever we reach out to people who don't know us and we try to get them to know us by sending a proposal or whatever, it's not happening. So I don't know how to bridge that divide in a way that's regenerative, keeping in mind that these are people who are being asked for money all the time for many worthy nonprofits, not just us. So, and it's not like we have local people that are, where we work in Latin America, those people don't have money. They're the recipients of the money that helps them do their work. So we can't ask them for money. So I don't know.
Yeah. Noticing there's a bit of an echo, so maybe just mute yourself.
Oh, I'll mute myself. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Find the mute button. Where is the mute? Oh, there it is. Okay.
You got it. Testing. Okay. Remember that regeneration. If you go back to the concept of autopoiesis, regeneration is a dynamic pattern that's able to keep itself expressing itself. It keeps going. And one thing that happens when dealing with like large foundations and grant writing is most of those large foundations are wealth hoarders who set up these, what are basically tax havens for their money. And they actually grow the capital by giving a small part of it away, and they avoid paying taxes. Like the Gates Foundation grows in wealth each year as it gives money away, because the amount of money it gives away is less than it would have had to pay in taxes. And everyone thinks it's philanthropy, but it's actually a tax haven. And so it's actually, you're getting the food scraps of an extractive system. And so one of the problems is when you're doing something that is a living system and you connect yourself to a life-destroying system, the life-giving part of your system eventually gets undermined or destroyed by that life-destroying system. So it's partly about what does your living organism connect itself to? And another thing is all living organisms and living ecosystems have a natural harmony at some scale. Bacteria don't get big, they stay small, whereas elephants are really big. And so you have the characteristic scale, and there are actually laws of biology, what's called allometric scaling, which we could talk about sometime, but it's kind of technical, where you can see how the size of the organism is limited by the thermodynamics of circulation. Can you circulate nutrients moment to every cell inside that big organism? And you need to have this fractal breakdown of patterns with nested levels to be able to get all the energy distributed. So something like a humpback whale has a much lower metabolism than a mitochondria because it's so much bigger. It has to distribute all that heat and energy. The lesson for us here about being regenerative is that we can achieve regenerative things at small scales that then don't get to a larger scale because they don't integrate into the right harmony of relationships that is necessary for the life to continue at the larger scale. So when we're doing something small scale and we try to connect with these extractive industries and the wealth hoarding institutions and tax havens that are called foundations and get money from them, which everyone has to compete for, you're one of 100 applicants for money that doesn't include overhead for your foundation, and et cetera, you end up in a situation where access to money becomes the thing that kills almost all projects. And if you look statistically, maybe there are 1,000 projects that are proposed, 5 of them are funded, and 1 of them is successful. And 5 years later, they're going to have survival bias. They're going to tell the story of the one successful project, and you're not going to know about the 999 others, because it's actually an environment that is toxic and hostile to life, to the life of these economies. And so the challenge becomes how to create small-scale economic patterns in our relationships to each other that can then grow in a healthy way to larger scales, and then achieve some kind of balance and harmony and not get bigger. And so I think a good example is what you're doing next week with your transformational conservation webinar, which is here using the Earth Regenerators platform, you're able to have a dialogue with a diverse set of very intelligent, knowledgeable, aware people that is a different composition of people than you'd find otherwise. And if you can find a harmonious flow, an exchange of value and trust and relationships, then something new might emerge from that. And so this is really important, is this, this learning edge, that living economies are also, in a fundamental way, they're unpredictable because they're creative. They're creating new things, they're solving problems in creative ways. So you can't really predict what they're gonna do. But just like measuring your heartbeat and your blood pressure, you can find diagnostics that tell you if they're healthy or not. And I think what you do is, if you look at your diagnostics, you don't have a very healthy economy for your nonprofit, even though you have some really good programs. So how do you create health in those relationships, which is different from how do you raise money, even though they overlap a lot of times. I don't know if that answers your question or not. What do you think about this?
Well, a couple thoughts. First, I want to say it's this week. It's this Friday.
Oh my God, yeah, what day of the week is it? Yeah, okay, thank you, it's this Friday.
If you're interested, this Friday, look on Earth Regenerative. But part of what I'm hearing you say is that, you know, I've been doing this for so long that I'm having trouble thinking out of the box. And I really need to think out of the box more of ways of doing things to gain support of whatever kind, whether it's money or other kind, rather than the traditional ways of going. And thinking smaller rather than bigger, perhaps. Is that a good reflection of what you were saying?
Yeah, and I would also say that it's not just thinking smaller, it's thinking healthier at the size you are. Because you don't know how big you're going to get. This thing you're doing.
Well, we already made the conscious decision not to get too big. So that we already agree with you about that. It's that to sustain what we're already doing, and we do have 2 or 3 other countries where we already started to establish relationships where we'd want to bring our same model to. And we don't need a lot of money to do it, but we do need some. So those are the kind of hurdles we're facing now.
Yeah, and I think at a more systemic level, trying to take the food scraps of the wealth hoarders is a losing strategy. And so like I'm not interested in applying for foundation money. If a small foundation approaches me and asks me to apply, I might. And even then I still might not. Because what I really care about is, and this is just a feeling, how do I feel about spending my time trying to get money when I'm effectively begging someone for money? Because they have all the power to say no. And what I really want is a commons. I want a situation where I can help shape the decisions and I'm an empowered participant. Remember, empowered participation is one of the principles of a regenerative economy. And so empowered participation, if it's absent, you don't have a regenerative economy. If it's present, you may still not have one because of other reasons, but you can feel that in your body. When you're applying for grants, it's pretty powerless most of the time. So that feeling of the vibrancy of feeling alive when you're in empowered relationships is worth all the difference just for the quality of life. And you're going to do really beautiful work. So I know that doesn't really fully answer your question, but I think these indicators, like how do I feel empowered to participate? That's a feeling. Your assessment is a gut check. How do I feel in this relationship? And I often, sort of half jokingly talk about it like dating to marry someone. I'm only half joking because committed relationships are committed relationships. So in that way, they're not that different. But you sort of date for a little bit and you're like, do I like this person? Do they treat me well? Do I feel good here? It should be the same way with funders. It should be the same way with any other kind of relationship. And I think us reclaiming that space gets back at what Jeff and I were talking about, of how we will feel regenerative patterns in our relationships to each other, even if we're not directly working with the land. Because these other parts of it are really, they're more important in some ways because they are what keep us from connecting back to the land. They are what keep us from landing in action that makes a difference. So yes.
Yes, I just want to say to the general audience that I did put our project down in general as one of the projects on that spreadsheet that PJ created. So if anyone has ideas and wants to help, add your name to my line. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Gail.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, no, it's a really important question. And I see we have one more question here coming in. Or is this a question? Let me see. But it's from Ria, and I'll invite Ria onto the screen so we can say hi for sure. Let me see the question. It says, remembering each other home by reframing, asking the right questions in dialogue, we can make others remember. Right now, I'm asking everyone around here if they don't feel it is crazy to use drinking water for flushing toilets. Well, Ria, I'm inviting you on the screen. I don't know if you're there and able to join, but let's just chat for a moment about how does it feel to be in this kind of conversation? And if you're there and you're able to join me, because one thing I see that's really important here is how these real world examples, like the one I told, is not meant to say, you must do it this way. It's just to show that this is not a marketing brochure that says, give me money because I did a good job. This is more like, look how messy and screwed up so much of this was, how much of it didn't work, and how we managed to make it work anyway by being a living system. That we ourselves, we showed up in relationships as part of a living system. And that's what made all the difference. And that's what's making the difference now for what we're able to do moving forward. So I guess Ria is not able to join me for some reason. So I'm not sure why that is. But I see Stan had a question here. So Stan, I'll invite you onto the screen for this one. Stan's question is, the example raises the regenerative capacity of place, but does it give you and family a means to live, a home and food, etc.? Isn't there still more needing to be regenerated as a food economy or shared sheltering? And I think Stan knows that my family's camping and doesn't have a house to live in at the moment. So Stan, hey, good to see you.
Well, thank you for the inspiration and, the deep learning. It's really quite brilliant. But I am having trouble, sort of like Jeff, bringing it home, really validating it in my own backyard kind of thing. I do have, some land, and I am getting the benefits of, having more birds, having, appreciating the flowers, getting more native species, and being able to do that with my daughter and granddaughter and stuff. So I can tell the life is better. And there's more multi-capital choices and, in some ways, wealth being created. So that all makes sense. And I also understand from, the commons that you give a lot to everybody invests $1 and pretty soon the commons is worth 10. And so, there is a real benefit of giving to get that. So the example makes sense, in the sense of creating place and creating better wealth for the indigenous families, including yourself. It's a cool place. But in the end, there is a need to create a home for your daughter, and in some ways, I think there's not only the trees and the multi-species, but in some ways it's a food system. Each thing is a food for something else, but then eventually, it needs to create food for you. So the idea of a food forest is very appealing, but I don't think the example comes quite around to the total food, a balancing of food. And so I'm wondering how you think of that, and in a sense of place, it's not just food, but it's also a kind of a security, right? That there is a home. Obviously, you're invited into homes, but there's always a risk, especially in a foreign country, that you won't necessarily really be allowed to have a home there over time. So how do you feel like you're vesting? So this is, when I work with Black Lives Matter and other communities, we can create jobs, like Jeff was saying, companies, but in the end, there's ownership. And not only empowered participation, with rewards, but some sort of a shared ownership in the place or in the food cycle, thinking of it more. So how do you think about your place in the cycle, and how does that balance out in terms of, the fundamentals for you and your family, but your daughter especially?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And the way we have approached it so far is we're seeking and we're cultivating love and care from members of the community. So like our daughter has friends with lots of other kids, and we're friends with the parents of the other kids. And those people come to love us as we come to love them, and they care about our well-being. So right now, the way that we're looking for a house to live in is we're asking our friends, if you hear about a house, let us know, because the housing situation is really difficult here right now. And because they love us and they care about us, they pay attention and they tell us if they hear something. So this loving and caring of very important commons is one way that we're doing it. And another is that we are giving ourselves to the landscape in different places until eventually there's enough capacity the landscape can take care of us. But the land is so degraded here and the economy is still so extractive here that it can't support us. We're sort of interlopers in an ecological sense. We show up here and we still take more than we give because the land is not able to generate enough from what we give. It's too early in that process. So for example, we're helping build a food forest in the bioparque, but we're not going to do a food forest in this origin of water land. That's just going to be a straight native forest. And that difference is because we need a diversity of types of landscape in the territory. And by having connection to more than one piece of land, we have more resilience because there's more love and care from people who will support us to help us to have livelihoods. But also over time, we'll become part of a tapestry of little places that are all part of the bigger bioregional place. And there will emerge, if this works, there will emerge a scale at which the territory takes care of us. And we may eventually have a piece of land, which is actually our goal, is to participate in a community project where we live and have our home on a piece of land where we also have a food forest. And we just aren't at the point yet where we can rally that capacity, but we're building the capacity to do that. So this is a really good question. And my answer now is, because we get more than we give from the land, we need to give more than we get to the community until we get to a place that the dynamic flow. And by the way, we're able to do that because I can attract and bring in things from the outside. So I bring in experts who come and do volunteer work. I bring in money for projects. And Jessica, my wife, brings all of her knowledge and experience, 10 years mushroom foraging and all the things she knows from the Pacific Northwest that she brings here. And as we bring what we can bring to the community, we give without asking much in return. And we're building capacities in the systems we're a part of, because none of them are properly regenerative yet.
Well,
none of them's at that scale.
So I've seen that work in a few capitalisms, like open source, has scaled and succeeded in generating, self-fulfilling enough assets that the whole exceeded the parts. But it's still struggling in a multi-capital environment to be preserved honestly. Even Google, who tried hard to do no harm, ended up, starting surveillance capitalism in Toronto and getting caught. And so I think it's really hard, in a multi-capital sense, to be fair. And I can see in the digital world, there's, leverage from seeds that can really help in the digital sense, the real world. But in the end, I think you're right. It is place, and we do have to have ownership in place. And the indigenous didn't have the power to preserve their patterns. And broadly, that's the case, right? Pareto, 80% of the land is owned by 20%. So I still think that's yet to be seen in an example.
And I think
I like the progress.
Yeah, and I think it's unlikely to be seen in an example for some time because we're so far into ecological overshoot at a planetary scale. And so the encroachment and the extraction of human consumption on the planet has taken us so far from balance. Like for myself, I'm doing work now, reforestation work, for 200 years from now. I'm never going to see, the systems I'm trying to help set in motion are not going to be anywhere near finished when I die. And so I don't expect to have fully regenerative systems, meaning regenerative economic systems, at the bioregional scale. What I aspire to is to create the patterns of them that can survive the rest of global system collapse, and then continue to develop and mature for the next few centuries afterwards, because I see this as longer term than one lifetime. And so I think you're absolutely right in your assessment. And I also think that we need to forgive ourselves or accept that we're at a stage where there's such environmental degradation and so much ecological overshoot that we have to basically keep living systems on life support to just not be overwhelmed in the destruction of the larger patterns. And that'll continue to be the case for probably a couple more decades, that this is a big, slow process by human terms. But absolutely, I think your point is spot on and very astute.
I like the weaving of multi-capitalism instead of mono-capitalism. I think that's part of it. And then I think the challenge for us to take Barichara and do it in our backyard, we have to kind of weave it in to our own backyard in some way. So we still have another step to do, I think, to really give you the leverage. But thank you.
I agree, and thank you, Stan. Lovely to see you again, my friend. And I see that we're actually getting a little far over time, although I'm really glad. Oh my God, the man who planted the trees. Thank you, Alan. I love that video. I was just watching the video of the man who planted trees with my daughter this morning at 5:30 in the morning. She got up and we sat and watched it together. So I want to thank you all for being here today. I know that we're over our agreed time, and I want to really honor everyone's time. And I hope that this case study is stimulating your thinking a little more and will provoke or evoke some good questions during the community Zoom calls this week. Of course, if you want to talk to me personally about this story and elaborate more, just reach out to me directly with a message on Earth Regenerators and we can chat. And just say, for me personally, the real gift here, the thing that I receive, is the honor of being the steward of this piece of land. I've never been a steward of a piece of land before. And to me, it feels like the land said, Joe, you're okay enough. You're not too messed up. You can come and help. And I'm like, thank you. I've been looking for land that would love me by letting me love the land. And it just feels so beautiful. So to share this story with all of you today for me is to be in this place of honoring the land. And it just feels great. So thank you all for being with me today and with us on this learning journey. And onward we go. So I'll see you all soon.